a very small opening in the skin, a painless opening in the skull below, quick and precise placement of threads into the cortex, and then we fill that hole in the skull with the sensor, allowing the scalp to be closed up over.
That's a very zoomed-in view. Applying them very delicately.
Of distinct electrodes. Here the robot is selecting individual electrode threads and placing them into the brain in the pre-planned location with remarkable accuracy and repeatability.
Nearly 100 billion cells called neurons. Neurons come in many complex shapes, but generally they have a dendritic arbor, a cell body called a soma, and an axon. The neurons of your brain connect to form a large network through axon-dendrite junctions called synapses. At these connection points, neurons communicate with each other using chemical signals called neurotransmitters. Neurotransmitters are released from the end of an axon in response to an electrical spike called an action potential. When a cell receives enough of the right kind of neurotransmitter input, a chain reaction is triggered that causes an action potential to fire, and the neuron to in turn relay messages to its own downstream synapses. Action potentials produce an electric field that spreads from the neuron and can be detected by placing electrodes nearby, allowing recording of the information represented by a neuron.
Our goal is to record from and stimulate spikes in neurons and do so in a way that is orders of magnitude more than anything that's been done to date, and safe and good enough that you can, it's not like a major operation. It's sort of equivalent to sort of a LASIK type of thing. So this is in contrast to the best FDA-approved system, which is like a Parkinson's deep brain stimulation thing, which would have on the order of 10 electrodes. So the system, even in version 1 that we're going to unveil today, is capable of 1,000 times more electrodes than the best system out there, and they're all read and write. So this is really quite, I mean, for something to be 1,000 times more than what is publicly approved is quite a big difference. So there's very tiny threads that are about a tenth, roughly, of the cross-sectional area of a human hair. So they're extremely tiny threads. In fact, the threads that we have, like I said, even in version 1, are about the same size as a neuron. So if you're going to go stick something in your brain, you want it to not be giant, you want it to be tiny, and to be approximately on par with the things that are already there, the neurons. You really need this to be done with a robot because it's very tiny and it needs to be very precise. So you don't want to pierce a blood vessel. So so each thread, the robot looks sort of basically through a microscope and inserts each electrode specifically, bypassing any vasculature, any kind of like blood vessel, and making sure it's it can be inserted without causing trauma or minimal trauma. So just to give you a sense of scale, this is how tiny the threads are. That is not even a big finger, that is a small finger. So these threads are just like I said, way smaller than a hair, and there's 1,000 of them. And this is what the robot looks like. It's sort of quite a complex device, but it all comes down to a very tiny point. So we want to just like you see the robot on the left, and then what looks like the needles for insertion next to a penny, but in fact the actual needle that gets inserted is way tinier. It's that little tiny thing at where the arrow is pointing. That's actually the size of the needle. It's about 24 microns in diameter. It's so small you can't really even see it in the picture with the penny. You can get a sense for the robot doing the electrode insertion. That's a very zoomed in view. So they're all very, very tiny, and the robot is very selectively applying them very delicately. And then this is what the chip looks like. So there's action potentials. So each one of those represents one electrode. So there would be up to 10,000 of these lines. The operation on a per chip basis, it involves just a 2 millimeter incision, which is dilated to 8 millimeters, and then the chip is placed through that, and then it goes back to being 2 millimeters, and you can basically glue it shut. You don't even need a stitch. And then the interface to the chip is wireless. So you have no wires poking out of your head. Very, very important. So it's basically Bluetooth to your phone. Because we'll have to watch the App Store updates for that one. Make sure we don't have a driver issue. And we hope to have this aspirationally in a human patient before the end of next year. So this is not far.
And so for the first product, we're really focusing on 3 distinct types of control. The first is giving patients the ability to control their mobile device, because we heard from over and over again from patient groups that if you have to have a caretaker around to press buttons for you, what's the point? You might as well have them do the thing. You have to get self-sufficient using the devices on your own. But we are working as hard as we can towards our first in-human clinical study next year.
This is, in fact, traces of a bunch of electrodes that came off of one of our devices, a bunch of electrodes from a single thread. And each trace shows you the voltage waveform in time as it's coming off of one of those threads. We have algorithms that can detect these spikes in real time as they're happening. And that allows us to collect data that looks something like this. This is what we call a spike raster. So each row there represents one channel of recording, and time goes from left to right. And each of those little tick marks is the time of a single spike in action potential. Now, if you look at that, you might think that looks pretty messy and it's not clear what's going on. But I'm going to do a little trick. I'm going to take those neurons and I'm going to rearrange them so that they're in the order of the tuning that they have, just as I told you about those 2 neurons. And if you do that, look what happens. Now suddenly structure emerges. And I think you'll agree, looking at that there's information in that stack of neurons that tells you about the movement. And that's exactly what we want to do. We want to do that kind of magic in an automated way to read out the movement. The way we do that is by building something that we call decoding algorithms. These are mathematical algorithms that we tune based on data like these to be able to take in just those rasters of spiking activity and output the movement that the person wants to make. For these little fake data, I built a very, very simple decoder, and sure enough, it's able to capture the intended movement. This is what we want to do on a bigger scale. That even if you're not actually making the movement, even if you're just thinking about the movement, or even if you're watching someone else make movement, the cells in motor cortex respond in a similar way. With that, we think that people will be able to get naturalistic control over their computers, not just a mouse, but also a keyboard, game controllers, and potentially other devices. That's what we're trying to do. So potentially, with a device like this, you could restore speech to a paralyzed person who's no longer able to talk. But there's no reason in principle that we can't reach all of motor cortex. And that would give us access to any movement that a person thinks about, any movement at all. A person could imagine running or dancing or even kung fu, and we would be able to decode that signal. What Neuralink wants to do is to give people the ability to tap into those representations, to get better access to that information, both to repair broken brain circuits, and also to ultimately give us better access to better connections to the world, to each other, and to ourselves.